Hey there everyone, it is I, the Doge that reads you the best, or worst, depending on how you look at it, D&D horror stories that I can find. In today's episode, we examine what happens when a couple joins a game, and they both turn out to be that guy, and, well, that lady. But first, it is time for a kitty party. And now that we have lightened up our spirits, let's get right into this tale of Dungeons & Dragons cringe. A saga of the problem player couple that plagued our table. Part 1. By Reddit user Mango Moonflower. Long-time lurker, first-time poster here. Also, obligatory I'm on mobile warning for any formatting issues. So, this happened a little over a year ago. I have been wanting to post about these two for a while, but I had trouble getting the story to flow in a sensible way. I realized it was because even though these two players were in a relationship and wreaking havoc on our group during the same time, they were problematic in very different ways. For that reason, instead of trying to tell all of the events chronologically, I'll go over the two separately. With that being said, let's meet our cast. Necro, our first problem player. He played an edgy turtle necromancer with a weird fixation on bones. Most of his sins happened out of character. Not Tiefling, problem player number 2. Played a changeling bard that had a tiefling appearance and a tiefling backstory. Was basically only a changeling for the lulz. Took the horny bard trope to a creepy level. Her sins were primarily in character. Everyone else will just be referred to by their class, because we had a big party, and I want to keep word soup to a minimum. So, for a little context, Not Tiefling was a co-worker of one of our group members, a monk, and approached her at work one day with interest in D&D, as most of Monk's co-workers were aware that she played. As luck, or misfortune in hindsight, would have it, we were about to start up a new campaign with some friends that had just moved into our area. Monk, who was friendly with Not Tiefling as a co-worker at the time, invited her and her fiancé, Necro, to join us with DM's permission. As previously stated, I am focusing on one problem player at a time, so I'll start with Necro, as most of his issues were out of character, and he was the lesser problem in my opinion. Necro was the reason that Not Tiefling had approached Monk about D&D, since it was through his brother that they were made aware of tabletop RPGs. From what he told us, his brother didn't want them joining because they'd cramp his style. After playing with the two of them, my suspicions are that it wasn't the real reason, but his brother's character also had somehow ascended to godhood and Vampire the Masquerade, so who can say for sure? Necro seemed to fancy himself as an intellectual, and for that reason, wanted to play a wizard. He chose a turtle for no other reason than their bonkers AC to balance out his squishiness. Now, the DM had given us a lore document that listed the common races and mentioned that exotic races were very rare. We tried to lead him towards a more conventional race, but since 3 of us were already planning to play exotic races, we had picked them out prior to the DM giving any solid statements about the setting. We didn't really have any ground to stand on. His issues, for me at least, started months before we even had our session 0. I am one of 3 artists we have in the group. All of us offered to do art of their characters for them, since it's just nice to have an idea of how the characters look. Now, I have an anime-inspired style that tends to be on the cuter side, as I use a lot of soft lines. Also, I typically draw humanoid characters. He asked me to do his character, and since it wasn't in my usual ballpark, I pointed him to our fighter instead, who has a much sharper style and was really good at monstrous designs. But he buttered me up by complimenting my style, and I eventually said I'd give it a try. I really wish I hadn't. He was the worst type of commissioner. I tried to get detailed information about what he wanted, and maybe some reference images. He gave me very little to work with, just vaguely dressed with dead animal parts and some runic symbols. So, to make sure he was happy, I sent him progress pictures, i.e. the basic pose sketch, design sketch, color mockup, etc. And he gave me the go-ahead at every step. Of course, that is until I had completely finished. All of a sudden, he wanted a complete overhaul on the design, even going back on stuff he specifically requested. I had to start over from scratch, and the way he offered critiques came off kinda rude, by grading elements of the design on scores of 1 to 10. At least, he kept the magnum opus of the original design, a sash fashioned out of vertebrae and fishing wire. Now, him being a bad commissioner did put me off, but that didn't mean he was going to be a bad player, and for the most part, he wasn't, at least not when he was in character. Despite an edgy backstory and him playing a necromancer in a good aligned party, he actually played along with the party's desires. He did have some minor main character syndrome, but it could have been worked around. Outside of character, though, was a different story. He insisted at having Session 0 at their place, which was a nightmare for a number of reasons. While the rest of us lived fairly close to each other, they were nearly a 30-minute drive out of the way in the middle of nowhere. He claimed to have a good space for playing, and considering that his older brother hosted his games, we were optimistic, and his brother's space did seem nice. Too bad we were instead sequestered into the tiny section of the house dedicated for them. They had a decent-sized table, but most of their seating was uncomfortably low for the height of the table. On top of that, instead of traditional lighting, they had these color-changing rave lights. They also had a very excitable dog, who was all over the rest of us. While the majority of us don't mind a little dog snuggling, this dog was constantly trampling over someone, and his untrimmed nails left some of us with some decent scratches. Necro ended up putting him into another room, but Not Tiefling argued for him to be let back out. Now, I didn't know about this until after we'd cut ties with them, but according to the other players, he said something along the lines of, "Do we need to go into the other room to have a talk?" to her because of this. Necro also really didn't like DM for some reason. If I were to guess though, with DM being one of the smartest people I know, and with Necro seeing himself as this intellectual, he might have felt threatened by him. On many occasions, he'd argue against our DM's rulings. One instance, during a non-canon battle royale we played due to a player being out of town, our druid used Ice Knife on a creature that he was next to. He failed his dex save against the Ice Knife's shattering effect, and took the appropriate damage. He tried to argue with the DM that it still shouldn't have hit because of his turtle shell. His turtle also had a thing for bones, and even had a ship made out of bone in his backstory. His obsession with them really became a problem when he tried to homebrew a spell, and I'll use the DM's own words, because he put it best. Quote, "Guys, he wanted to be able to turn enemies into bone, no save, with a fucking level 2 spell. I asked him to look at other level 2 spells to get an idea of what power they have, and he was just like, 'I don't know, man. Seems like something I should be able to do already.'" He also didn't consult the DM when coming up with his character's backstory. In his backstory, an aboleth showed up and destroyed his entire people, leaving only him behind. While aboleths existed in our DM's world, because of some fuckery with the plane of water, they lived beyond 100 feet below the surface, and wouldn't have been able to come close enough to surface to pick off an entire people. He refused to work with our DM to come up with an alternative backstory, so our DM, frustrated, just decided not to put any of his backstory details in the campaign. Less prevalent, but Necro also had this weird habit of parenting Not Tiefling. He'd scold her for her decisions and use his character to make her behave more suitably, which, when we cover her, will make some sense, but the whole dynamic was just weird. This post ended up being way longer than I expected it to be. Next time, I'll cover the real big fish, Not Tiefling. you can expect adventures of foot fetish shenanigans and boofing crab shells. If you have any questions or need any clarification about what happened in this part, leave a comment and I'll do my best to answer. I'll see you next time. Quick edit. So, I showed this post to my party members, and Monk pointed out something crucial that I forgot. During Session 0 at their place, Necro also tried to convince Not Tiefling to feed their dog a pot brownie to settle him down. I shouldn't have to explain why that's bad. Well, it certainly sounds like there was some weird power dynamics between those two, and Necro definitely had a bit of main character syndrome, with the not wanting to budge on his backstory in order to make it fit into the DM's world building, and then getting upset at not having an overpowered homebrew spell. Also, feeding a dog a pot brownie. Dude, chocolate kills us. You know, 'cause I'm a Doge, and totally not a human. But by the sounds of it, it looks like this story is just going to get crazier. So let's all find out together, shall we? Part 2. Something I failed to mention in Part 1, with exception of Necro's art commission from Hell. All these stories all take place over the course of only 5 sessions, 6 counting the non-canon Battle Royale. So, DM is the type that likes to tie in backstories into the campaign, so he asked for us to write a little background information and give it to him prior to Session 0. While Necro gave DM a backstory that didn't really fit, at least he gave him something. The same could not be said of Not Tiefling. She just wouldn't give him anything. It was so bad that he had to set a date for people to submit backstory information to him. She sent it on the day of. It was maybe 4 sentences long, and based on the writing style and how ignorant she seemed when the DM would bring up stuff from her backstory, we are almost 99% sure that Necro wrote it for her. So, right off the bat, Session 0. It was pretty obvious that there was some disconnect with Not Tiefling on what the tone we were going for was. We tend to play more serious games, and we thought we'd communicated that. She wanted to name her character Fart, and seemed very confused when we weren't on board with that name. Necro talked her into picking something else. She also didn't seem to realize that there was math in D&D, despite all the math rock jokes we were dropping in the Discord. So, there were 2 primary goals of our Session 0. 1. Help the new players with their character sheets. In addition to Necro Not Tiefling, Druid and Rogue were also new. And 2. Group up the party. Getting the new players set up took longer than we expected, so we were only able to get 3 players to the starting destination by the end of this session. DM requested everyone else meet up with him privately to get them to the same destination, so it wouldn't take up table time. Everyone agreed to this, but when it was Not Tiefling's turn, she just continuously ghosted him until time for Session 1 had rolled around. Outside of game, Monk asked her about this. It seemed like when the game was explained to Not Tiefling, she fixated on the improvisation part and thought of it as a "whose line is it anyways" type of game. She seemed to lose a lot of interest after it was explained that it was more character building and math. Most of us expected her to drop out before Session 1. It was understandable, and no one was going to blame her for not wanting to play after realizing it wasn't what she thought. Well, she decides to play anyway. DM quickly cooked up the story that she was just kidnapped from her home island, and that's how she ended up on the slave ship that the rest of us were on. And the issues start basically right away. So, we start. We're all chained up. Necro uses 2 knock spells to get our fighter and monk out. Together, they take out the guard with a key, hand it off, and then head up deck to start chipping away at our other captors up there. The key makes its way to Necro, an important NPC captive, and then to Not Tiefling. Now, instead of handing off the key to any of the 3 remaining PC captives, she decides to go off with the key and start skinning and looting the dead guard that is below deck. The rest of us are begging for her to unlock us. She doesn't. The NPC goes for the mace the dead guard had so he can help the PCs fight up deck. Not Tiefling decides that she wants the mace instead, and is going to fight him about it. Here is where another issue comes up. She hasn't made up her spell list at all. Our ever-gracious and ever-suffering DM allows her to pick spells as we play, with the caveat that they will be locked into her spell list when she picks them. So, she basically picks all of her spells with tormenting this one NPC in mind. Luckily, she's a bard, and doesn't know much about spells, so the worst she does to this NPC is burn him with heat metal. Eventually, I just convince him to give up the weapon to her in exchange for the key, with the promise that I'll make him a weapon that he can use when he unlocks me, as I play a creation bard. So, finally, at the end of the session, Druid, Rogue, and I are able to get free. Session 2. Now that the whole party is free, we are able to start taking out captives at a faster rate. Meanwhile, Not Tiefling is still below deck, harassing the same NPC who is trying to find his old gear. We eventually take over the ship, with no help from her. We exchange names and end the session. As a side note, I'd like to add that our problem player number 1, Necro, spent a significant amount of time this session trying to swim away from the rest of the party for no real reason. Session 3. We find an item on board that converts salt water into fresh water, which is pretty crucial since we are in the middle of the sea. Unfortunately, one of the only container options we have is a magic rope Not Tiefling found that can curl into a bowl. As a result, she is tyrannical about who gets what. The warlock decided to steal some water, and she doesn't notice, but still metagames to find out it was him. Unnecessary PvP ensues, and I end up placating her in character by having my character offer a token from her home island as payment for the missing water. Session 4. She played remote, so this was one of the only tolerable sessions she was part of. Session 5. The real disaster session, which ultimately leads to them getting kicked. The first troubling incident of the night was when she argued with the DM about Necro getting to pick where his character ended up, after a 4-hour downtime period. No matter how much our DM explained character autonomy, she just kept escalating it. Well, if he's below deck, I'm... insert location several islands away, now. Why was she so peeved about it? Well, she had used Speak with Animals to talk to some orcas that were curious about the ship our characters were on, and promised to feed them Necro's turtle. Druid, who had an herb pouch and a high roll, cooked up some pretty tasty food. Upon getting a whiff of it, several PCs asked her to cook their food for them like normal people. Not Tiefling though. She decides that Druid needs some buttering up, and by that, I mean she took this opportunity to get off on her in real life foot fetish by getting way too personal with Druid's feet, toe sucking and all. Druid, having a very polite and passive player, tries to just tell her that that's not necessary. This does not work, and awkward laughter ensues. She also made a pass at Warlock in a similar toe-sucking manner, but Warlock's player was better at shutting it down. Later, she makes an offhand comment about planning to take my character's virginity to Fighter, who is my character's protector and father figure, which is made especially weird in character because my character looks young for her age as a result of being an ASMR, combined with Fighter calling her kid. Most were under the impression that she was underaged. We mention this to Not Tiefling, and she doesn't care. Time passes again, and she gets a hold of a bucket of multicolored crab shells that came from the fishing vessel our monk worked on prior to the campaign, where the rest of her crew got killed. Monk saw them and was sad and went off to sulk in the captain's hut. Not Tiefling wanted to hump the door of the cabin Monk went into, but thankfully, our DM stopped it with "the captain's hut doesn't have a door," Warlock, seeing how upset Monk was, attempted to get the crab shells as a way to cheer her up. Now, this is where it really escalates. Not Tiefling was insanely stubborn and wouldn't let Warlock have even one of them, despite multiple peace offerings from multiple characters. Warlock got fed up and was planning to just try and swipe them from her, but she tried to meta that she had laced them on a steel rope, and when the DM didn't allow that, she took it a step further and said that she wanted to have hidden them up her ass. So, is that how you use the 3 seashells? It was at this point she seemed to realize that, out of character, we were all kinds of sick of the situation. Not Tiefling. How many crab shells do I have to swallow to die? Because it seems like everyone just wants my character to die. DM. You don't have to do that. Your character can be difficult or raunchy. It's just that you're at an 11 right now, and I need you to be more around a 7. Not Tiefling. I just put a lot of myself in this character. DM. It's just that we like our games to be more serious, so the types of jokes we have in person really don't work in game. It doesn't mean we don't like you, we just need to tone it down. Not Tiefling. But this is me toning it down. DM. And it would be fine if you just played your character as less contrary and attempted less sexual things with fellow PCs without their consent. Not Tiefling. Are you calling me a rapist? DM. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, we're just gonna call it there, and we'll talk over Discord, Not Tiefling. After her and Necro left, the rest of the group had a discussion about their behavior and how we wanted to move forward. We agreed we would discuss the issues, and depending on how they responded, we'd give them 2 sessions to improve. If you read the disclaimer at the beginning of this part and did the math, you'll have a pretty good idea on how they responded to our critiques. Anyways, this part will be too long if I continue on to how we finally rid ourselves of the problematic duo. Don't worry, the next one will be shorter, so hopefully I can get it out soon. I'll see you then. Well, OP wasn't lying when they said that the story would get more weird. Not Tiefling really just wanted to make it her show, it seems like. It's like she didn't realize that D&D is supposed to be a cooperative game. Holding the key, wanting the weapon that another character wanted, and taking it to the point of torturing the NPC, and holding the only thing that could hold water, and just being a bitch about it, are all to the detriment of the party. Then to inject her fetish of the feet variety onto unwilling participants is super creepy. I hope that this isn't going to be a new theme in these stories, like the pregnancy thing. Anyway, the DM was gracious enough to at least confront her on her behavior, and she took it as well as suspected. Let's find out what happens next in the final part of the saga. Part 3. Finale. So, when we left last time, the DM was planning to have a conversation with Not Tiefling about the dumpster fire that was our last session. It turns out he didn't even need to initiate. She messaged first. Somehow, still confused about what she was doing wrong and why no one said anything to her directly. Our ever-patient DM listed out the grievances. Being contrary, trying to name her character Fart, trying to boof crab shells, the foot stuff, PvP, not making an effort to learn how her class worked. He mentioned how we had, in fact, addressed stuff. We just did it in the flow of the game, so we didn't have to full stop coach her about what she was doing wrong at every corner. She said she'd probably just quit and leave us to our game. Our DM gave her until 2 days before our next session to decide for sure. Necro also messaged the DM at the time to tell him that it was weighing heavy on Not Tiefling and asking if he was doing anything wrong. To a lot of us, it almost seemed like he was trying to throw her under the bus with the way he phrased it. The DM said he was mostly fine in character, but the dynamic between him and Not Tiefling made things tense sometimes. He also wasn't a fan of how Necro would be so questioning to his rulings. Then Necro just didn't respond. So, the deadline DM set for Not Tiefling rolls around. Now she has decided to take our critiques and stay in the game, or she has decided it's not for her and she's going to stop playing with us. It was neither. She's decided that we were wrong to say that she was doing bad because it was only that one time, and she's going to keep going how she was. Great. The DM tried to point out other incidents and explain why they were wrong, but she just kept insisting that it wasn't as bad as we were saying. We all were honestly miffed. So we debated for a while whether we were going to give her those chances to shape up, or if we were just going to kick her because she seemed so unreceptive. Monk advocated for letting her have the second chance, mostly because of the co-worker situation. The rest of us were over it though. The fact that she was basically throwing out our concerns was so frustrating, and we couldn't see her improving. We also discussed whether to just kick her out, or to kick Necro out with her. This was when a lot of the incidents covered in Part 1 came out. So, the majority ruled that both of them needed to go. The DM spends the day drafting up a message to kick them. We review it, and make sure it's professional, and list out all of the grievances so they can't deny them. We wait for Monk to get off work so she doesn't have to be around Not Tiefling when the news drops. Then we fired it off. They don't take it well, of course. Not Tiefling starts chanting at us to tell it to her face, like a middle schooler trying to initiate a fistfight. Meanwhile, Necro, with his superior intellect, calls our conflict resolution skills subpar, and tells us how he'd rather not consort with us. I don't remember a lot of details after that, but it gets ugly. Monk, Warlock, and I stay on the sidelines while Fighter and the usually passive Druid give them a verbal smackdown, occasionally tagging in DM and Rogue. Once things tethered out, Monk deleted the Discord with those two on it, and we moved to a friend Discord we had before. Not Tiefling does text Monk later, asking why she didn't defend her, and Monk, to keep the work peace, just said that she didn't like confrontation. And that's the last we heard of them directly. Through work rumors, we found out that after they got married, they tried to change their names to absolutely bonkers names, which included religious and scientific terms they didn't even seem to understand the meaning of. The state naturally rejected the name change. They eventually moved out of our state, which we jokingly like to take credit for. And that is the end of our ordeal with the problem player couple. Luckily, we haven't had any trouble with any other player before or since, but I have had some DM troubles recently. Depending on what comes of that, this may not be the last tale. Anyways, until then. Honestly, were we expecting them to take getting booted from the game in stride? It went about as expected from someone who thinks that they are intellectually superior, and from someone else who wanted to be named Fart and force foot fetish stuff on people. Thankfully, not only does the party not have to deal with this power couple any longer, but Monk also doesn't have to deal with Not Tiefling at work anymore, since they moved out of state. Have you ever dealt with any power couples of that guyisms in any games of tabletop RPGs like this? If so, how did you handle them? Did you kick them out? And if so, how did they take it? Be sure to let us know in the comments. If you have a story that you would like to be shared on the channel, be sure to post it in the comments on the channel subreddit, or even feel free to just DM me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you who like and watch my videos, and I hope that you never run into a couple like the one in this story. Until next time.